So finally, I get to the video where I outline step 1 of the 12-step fellowships, like Alcoholics Anonymous, etc. Because my theory is that everybody could benefit from this. So in a sense, this is a series that's going to explore each step and the principles behind it and see if this is something that's useful to ordinary people that don't have addiction problems, because it's often been noted that this is a possibility, this is something that could work. So the 12 steps obviously are the methods by which addicted people get clean and sober, but it's a lot more than that, because as most recovering addicts will tell you, living a life drug and alcohol free is not just about stopping drugs. It's much more complex than that. It's about changing yourself. So the principle and agent of change is the relationship you build with a sponsor or a mentor in the program and your peers in the program, and being held accountable by to your sobriety by them, but also the rules you live by, the code of living that you live by, which we call a program. And central to that is the 12 steps. Those are the agents of change. That working the steps is what changes you. And obviously, if it can change addicted people, it can change anybody, right? So I'm going to start right at the beginning, and I'm going to do a separate video on each one. See if ordinary people can find it useful, and also just kind of translate it a bit for ordinary people, because it sometimes sounds a bit mystical and a bit religious and a bit cultish, which it isn't really. These are age-old, solid principles that can apply to anything or anyone. So here goes. Step 1 of the various 12-step fellowships goes as follows. Admitted we were powerless over, fill in the blank, and that our lives had become unmanageable. So obviously an alcoholic would say, admitted that I am powerless over alcohol and my life has become unmanageable. A gambler would say, admit that I am powerless over gambling and my life has become unmanageable, and so on. So my contention is that obviously you can be powerless over people, places and things as much as you can a chemical. So this could apply to anybody. Somebody might say something like, I'm powerless over my marital issues or the breakdown of my marriage. I'm powerless over my country's economy going to hell. I'm powerless over this thing that I'm stuck in my life. Now the question of course is, are you powerless? And so straight away you're onto a sort of controversial topic, and this has been studied obviously for a long time. The Stoics talked about this long before 12-step fellowships obviously came into existence. Specifically Epictetus, who was a Stoic philosopher, a slave. There were other Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius, who was an emperor. So the Stoics were a very wide-ranging group of people, but Epictetus is known for having a concept called the dichotomy of control, or the concept of pro-hieresis in Greek. Hieresis, I think, means choice, something like that. So pro-hieresis means pro-choice, which doesn't mean what most people usually think it means. It means, do I have the ability to make a choice here? Is this up to me or not up to me? Is this under my control or not under my control? So the dichotomy of whether something is under my control or not, or in other words, do I have power over it or not? So that is the situation that an addicted person is in. And you could argue it's the situation that all people will be in at some point in their lives with seemingly insurmountable problems, big problems. Right? And the counterintuitive finding of 12-step fellowships and the recovery movement is that we are not powerful over the chemical or substance or addiction that's taken over our lives. This is a very controversial and well-known point about 12-step movement. Addicts in recovery who are using the 12 steps have come to the conclusion that they do not have power over their addictive behavior. Clearly, obviously, otherwise they would stop it, right? So in other words, they are powerless over it. So it immediately falls into that category of things that Epictetus would say, not up to me. So Epictetus had a rather odd selection of things that he thought weren't under his control, like health and things like that. He thought that the health was sort of in the hands of the gods, as it were. Whereas these days we'd probably say, for example, no, it's significantly under my control, right? I can do something about my health. So we would probably argue with Epictetus about what isn't under our control. But we could perhaps make a list of things, right? Let's say the decisions of the government are largely out of my control. I might be able to affect a small local politics over a long period, but today the actions of my government are out of my control, not up to me. The weather patterns are not up to me. To some extent the actions of other people, of course, are not up to me. Your own children might be an exception to that, but mostly the actions of others are not up to me. What is up to me? My own actions, my own behaviors, my own thoughts. So curiously, you would think that your addictive behavior would be in that camp. Not so, according to us, and I'll explain why. So, we admitted that we were powerless over drugs or alcohol. This is a concept called powerlessness, which is very, very misunderstood. We live in a culture, and I usually accord to this kind of idea. So this is why addiction is so counterintuitive. The recovery movement uncovers many unconventional wisdoms. Right, so I would usually be a champion of agency and choice and not being a victim and taking control of matters instead of being a victim. That's the whole sort of flavor of my philosophy, right? But that's like, the way I would explain it is, addiction's a bit like a black hole. There's the rest of life and then there's addiction. Or there's the universe with its mechanistic laws and then there's a black hole where those laws don't apply. So this is an area where really counterintuitive ideas are to be found. So powerlessness is the idea that you can't actually fix a problem. You can't fix it, which is not how we're brought up in Western culture. Funnily enough, in a lot of Eastern cultures, the idea of you not being able to have power over something is much more understood and accepted and not seen as weakness. But in our culture it is, because we have a culture of rugged individualism, which for most of the time I'm fully supportive of. But in the case of addiction, as any recovering addict will tell you, there comes the point where you realize that quite obviously you cannot win. You are not going to win. The addiction is bigger than you. Now, I've done other videos on the neurochemistry of why that is the case. Like, addiction is clearly, we now understand, to some extent, a frontal lobe pathology. It's not just a hyper-reward focused pathology, brain pathology. It's also affecting memory and learning, and also your frontal lobe function, your executive control, your impulse control. Right, so when somebody's a mid to end stage addict, as I would call it, they are not going to control their addictive behavior. As soon as they start using their drug, they'll be off on a run because their prefrontal cortex has been bypassed, right? But just in philosophical and spiritual terms, we could understand perhaps and accept perhaps that there are some monsters that are bigger than us, and when we dance with them, we should not fool ourselves that we can control the dance or the wrestling match. We will in fact be beaten. It's as realistic as saying this much, much bigger guy who is very well versed in wrestling and grappling is going to beat me, right? There's no way that I'm going to outstrength this guy or out-technique this guy. It's just not realistic. And there are some problems in life that are of that nature. And for an addict, obviously, it's their crack addiction, their heroin addiction, their fentanyl addiction, their gambling disorder. These things, by definition, they can't stop. They are an addict. They want to stop. They often, the stereotype of a junkie or an alcoholic living under a bridge, sleeping on a cardboard box is, of course, not very realistic. Probably most people with addictive disorders are functioning. They're working jobs, they're running businesses. Sometimes they are very high functioning. They might be presidents or prime ministers, right? So addicted people can display control, common sense, and such faculties in certain areas of their life. They cannot control other areas of their life. They display powerlessness. It's the dichotomy of control. There are things that they cannot fix. So here's the thinking in 12-step language or 12-step philosophy. We need to find the things that we cannot fix quite quickly. And for an addict, it might be, I can run my business more or less, but I can't control my drug use. And of course, as that increases, my ability to function in the other areas will decrease. But the idea that this is a progressive illness, it does not get better. And again, we've got plenty of neuroscience to explain why that's the case. Addictive disorders appear to create, they're chronic. Once you've got that memory and learning of how to hyper-reward yourself when you feel stressed or whatever, you're not going to forget it. And in that sense, it's a chronic condition. You're not going to ever forget that. And so you're always vulnerable to that if you take the drug. So the idea is, if we take the drug, we will become powerless over it, and it has power over us. So obviously you can extend that to include more or less anything in life, potentially. So the question is, what is and what is not up to us? What is and what isn't under our control? So when something's not under our control, we are powerless over it. So that's the idea behind step 1 of the 12 steps and powerlessness. It's not weakness, it's having this, being savvy, having the street smarts to work out what things you can control or which ones you can't, or who you could stand in the wrestling ring with and who you couldn't. And when you couldn't or when you can't, there are other things that you can do. You can adopt different tactics to win, right? In short, you will surrender to win. So the wisdom here in step 1 for addicted people, what helps addicted people and what could be used by everybody else if they understood it, is understanding that there are problems we cannot fix. Now, this is shown quite clearly in the famous 12-step prayer that most people would probably have heard of, called the Serenity Prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So that is the 12-step fellowship's way of talking about what the Stoics would have called dichotomy of control. Let's learn to accept things we can't change and to change things that we can change. So if you think about it, we will often go through life trying to change things that we should be accepting and accepting things that we should be changing. And the only thing we really need first out of the gate is to understand the difference between the two, because we can't even do that. And if we can't even do that, we've got a big problem, right? So we need to understand there are some problems that we cannot fix. So that old classic, like, God will never give you, or life will never give you things you can't handle. That's nonsense. That's patently nonsense. Life will frequently give you problems that you cannot fix, mountains that you can't climb, things that you can't handle. And in that moment, or before you begin to try and solve that or deal with it, the wisest thing to do is to separate out the things that you can and cannot control. Is this a problem I can fix? If it is, then go forward and do it. But if it isn't, you need to admit it. Now, obviously, addiction is a classic, because the whole of society is telling you, you should be strong enough to deal with this. We're rugged individualists. How dare you behave in such a way, and so forth. And of course, the person mostly doesn't really want to carry on behaving like that, but they can't control it because it's a frontal lobe pathology. And they will keep bashing their head against the wall, trying to solve their addiction with willpower. And that isn't going to work, because the neurochemistry of the addiction is much more powerful than their willpower. In short, it's their sort of hindbrain, reptilian brain areas really, that are in control of the reward seeking, and their willpower is really just the sort of puny human cortex that's only recently evolved, and it's not a match for the age-old, like, big thick looms in the hindbrain that drive addiction forward. So what do? Well, we realize that self-will and self-reliance, so these are, self-will is another 12-step concept. The idea that willpower is what you'd usually call it. And we eventually, in the following steps, steps 2 and 3, are going to go forward and explore what a higher power would look like, or what God's will. Obviously, 12-step fellowships are non-sectarian and contain many people who don't really even have a traditional theistic conception of God. So without getting into the complexities of that, let's just say that there is self-will on the one hand, or willpower, and then there is some kind of higher power, which might include a group, a support, it might be a group or a support group to do with the addiction, or a group of advisors or elders who can see your business problem better than you can, whatever. But that power is more likely to pull you out of this situation than your own willpower. You can keep throwing willpower at the situation, you can keep failing and banging your head against the wall, because there are some problems that cannot be fixed with willpower because they're too big for you to be able to deal with them on your own. So the other aspect of step 1 there, though, was unmanageability. So what is unmanageability? Realized admitted we were powerless over drugs, alcohol, the takeover of my company, the invasion of my country, the tornado or hurricane that's coming in. There are many, and the damage that's going to cause. There are many things I can't control. Okay, so I admit that I'm powerless over this thing. Then counterintuitively, I'm within range now of solving it, because I can adopt a tactic that's greater and more powerful than my own willpower or my own self-reliance. I can be humble enough to open myself up to a group effort or something like that to solve the situation, because alone it's not under my control. But the other aspect of step 1 was unmanageability. Admitted I'm powerless over drugs, alcohol, and my life has become unmanageable. What does unmanageable mean? Well, obviously it means a mess. My life has become a mess through trying to solve issues on my own that I have no power to solve, failing to know the difference between things I can solve and things I can't on my own, and therefore my life is a mess because of it, a disorganized mess. I'm late for everything because I'm always using. I always wake up feeling ill. That leads on to me not being able to accomplish my tasks. People are losing faith in me because I clearly have an addiction issue. That's all unmanageability. But another read on the concept of unmanageability is what I call, or what many people call, the sort of concept of the sovereign citizen. So if you've ever seen any of these YouTube videos of individuals refusing to answer the questions of the traffic police because they're a sovereign citizen. Now, whatever you think of that politically, I suppose one side of it is quite admirable, standing up for free speech, not allowing tyrannical powers to just go unchallenged. On the other hand, when you watch these videos, a lot of these people are just really annoying, right? And that, if you look at it from that side, that's what's meant by unmanageability. Defiance, refusing to be a person who follows rules, sort of egotistically believing that you don't have to listen to anyone. The idea, your ego is not your amigo, right? In these situations where you're addicted, or where your company's failing, or where your country needs or your community needs help, and it's really suffering, your ego is not going to be your amigo in this situation. You need to get it out of the way. So the sovereign individual is one who's saying, no, I'm an exception to the rules, I'm a sovereign individual, and they don't listen. They do not recognize any boss, they do not recognize any authority, and that's fine, free spirit and all of that. But there are situations in which that is not going to work. Your ego is not going to be your amigo. And that, again, was a Stoic idea. It's an early Christian idea as well, and it's worked its way. It's there in every religion, isn't it? Obviously, Buddhism do not identify with the self. The concept of no self in Buddhism. If you take yourself, how's about you take yourself actually out of the equation instead of making yourself the absolute focus of the situation, as with the sovereign individual. Myself is the most paramount thing here, and I recognize no authority and I defy it completely. That might be great in some situations, but not where you're being crushed by a problem that you cannot fix. So I would argue in that scenario, the police and the state, if you like, are the force against which you cannot win. And given that they've got a gun on their hip, it might profit you to find a less egotistical and confrontational solution to the problem and play a longer game. If indeed you are an activist for the rights of the individual, great. But there might be a better way of doing it than direct confrontation, your will against theirs, because you're going to lose that one and you're going to get dragged out of the car, right? So that's a really good analogy for unmanageability. Addicts in particular have a tendency to be extremely defiant, and I mean that in the psychological terms, not a personal terms. I'm not making a personal criticism there about any addicted people. I am one. Half the people I know are in recovery from addiction. It's a trait. It sometimes hides very effectively, so the person looks quite humble. But addicted, it has been noted by us, ourselves, that addicted people have the trait of defiance. That's unmanageability. Don't recognize direction from others. Reject it outright, just as standard. Just I will not listen to others, or follow rules, or follow traditions, or follow directions, or follow well-meant advice. And when you hit a wall in your life, you might want to reconsider that. You might want to consider becoming manageable. You know, what if I wasn't the smartest person on earth? What if the things that other people have to say to me might have something in them? That's not an open invitation to be guided by idiots. Of course, you still have to use your discretion, but it's an opening. So all of this is about opening up, really. Remember the first word of the step, admitted. So an analogy that's often used here, the good one to read, is a guy called Joe McHugh, who wrote a sort of easy to understand version of the steps, 12 steps, called The Steps We Took by Joe McHugh. And in step 1, he uses the analogy of the prodigal son, who's in the hog pen, as he calls it. So you imagine, the prodigal son is in the hog pen, eating corn with the pigs, and he suddenly realized, I shouldn't be here. What am I doing here? I need to go home to my dad. Can you imagine, in a way, the humility that 180 turnaround requires? It requires you to admit that you've gone wrong. What am I doing? I'm here in the hog pen. Of course, he left his father and became a prodigal son, right? And he used his inheritance. He burned up all his inheritance on drinking and womanizing. And now he's in poverty, living in the hog pen, eating the corn with the hogs. And he realizes, I'm in the wrong place. I don't want to be here anymore. I admit that I'm wrong, and I'm going to go home to my dad. Which of course is something similar when people don't want to admit that they've taken a wrong path. They don't want to admit that they've destroyed or was kind of wiped out their 20s and early 30s with drug addiction, right? Because to admit that you are addicted and you cannot stop, and that you cannot help yourself, that you are done, finished, in a dreadful state and completely powerless to change it. You've tried 100 times, you can't stop. That then also requires you understanding that you mistakenly think that you have destroyed your life. Actually, it's bigger than that, as we explained, because this thing was out of your control to start with. So all that's required really is an admission of that fact, and you can start to work your way out of it. But of course, the very admission itself seems to invite lots of horrible realizations that you perhaps don't want to connect, right? Now let's imagine you've got overextended with your company and your company's in debt, but you already invested most of what you have into it. So many people I see, they won't do what really you should do at that point, and what most successful entrepreneurs have done many times, which is to wind the business up. Talk to any entrepreneur, they'll have 3 failed companies to 1 successful one. But what really blows you up, you know, permanently blows you up and takes you out of the game forever, is losing everything. And that happens when people can't see this thing isn't going to turn around and there's no point throwing the rest of your savings into it, which people routinely do. They'll throw good money after bad because they can't bring themselves to admit that they can't fix it and it's finished over. This is a problem they can't fix. It's not going to get better. They need to throw the towel in. So this is unconventional wisdom. This is an exhortation to throw the towel in. I mean, how many times are you going to hear people advise you to do that or to say that that's a noble thing to do in Western culture? You're never going to hear it. And that is the central foundation stone of 12-step fellowship, and it is completely misunderstood, because that throwing the towel in is absolutely it is a ballsy move. It is a sensible, street smart move. It's saying, I'm not going to win this wrestling match. I'm not egotistical, stupid and sheltered and childish. I realize I'm not going to win this wrestling match. I need to go away and do some other kind of training, enlist the help, get coaching, call the fight off, agree to terms, whatever I need to do to survive, come back and fight another day. It's surrendering to win. It's surrendering so you can fall back, find a better position, and be realistic and adult about this and come back and be effective. And as is so often the case, that requires humility, because it requires enlisting the help of others, which of course then means asking for the help of others. So this is an admission of having gone down the wrong road. Another analogy that Joe McHugh uses, square peg, round hole. You get the furniture from IKEA, you throw the instructions in the bin immediately because you're a man and you know how to fix this, right? 20 minutes later, it's a complete mess. And your wife is telling you, look, just get the instructions out of the bin and follow the instructions. Those bits don't go there. It's a mess. Slow down, be less egotistical, and follow the instructions. So sometimes when we are able to admit that we don't know what we're doing here, we're using the wrong system here, we're out of answers, that is the beginning of change. So you can't carry on with an incorrect method, is the basic teaching here. And you must come to understand that you have been using the wrong method. And that's a hell of a thing to do. People in general do not like to do that. In fact, the world is absolutely characterized by the non-doing of that. And recovering addicts are a beacon, really, of people who've learned to have the humility to admit they've been doing it wrong the whole way, and they need to turn and get higher power directed instead of lower power directed or self-directed.